We're on? Okay. So we're here to discuss the documentary, Far East, Deep South. It's about a Chinese American family discovering their roots in the segregated South, basically Mississippi. It tells a very personal story of the family, and it also is very educational in terms of what it explores about what it was like for Chinese immigrants in the Deep South, their relationship to white residents, to Black residents. I found it very moving and really was also very informative. So let me just introduce myself first. I'm Grace Shin. I'm a Korean American immigrant. I was brought to this country at the age of 6 to New York. So I grew up in New York, finished high school there, ended up in Maryland for college. And then my parents moved to Dallas, Richardson, when I was a freshman, and I ended up following them to Texas. So I ended up at UT Austin, graduated there, and then moved to Dallas, went to law school at SMU, and here I am, I never left. Currently, I'm an ADA with the Dallas County DA's office. And for what it's worth, I'm not here in my capacity as an assistant district attorney. I'm here as just, an Asian American. So let me go through the rest of the panel. Larissa Lam, she's the director of the film. Larissa made her directorial debut with the award-winning short documentary, Finding Cleveland, with her husband, Baldwin, who's the subject of this documentary along with his family. Larissa has spoken at universities and TEDx conferences about topics such as diversity in the media and the Asian American experience. She's currently the host of an advice radio show for young adults, co-hosts the podcast Love, Discovery, and Dim Sum with her husband, Baldwin. Baldwin is a producer. Baldwin directed this film, and he and his, sorry. The film, I misspoke. Baldwin produced the film. He's directed by his wife in the film. Baldwin is a graduate of the Act One film producing program. He's spoken at numerous panels on issues of race, immigration, and Asian American representation in media. One really interesting fact about Baldwin, he is also a rapper known by the stage name Only One. That's spelled W-O-N. I thought that was pretty cool. Next is Reverend Dr. Michael Waters. He's the founder and lead pastor at Abundant Life African Methodist Episcopal Church in Dallas. He has many titles. He's a pastor, professor, award-winning author, activist, and social commentator. He holds his BA, master's, and doctoral degrees from SMU. He's a prolific speaker who has addressed numerous bodies such as American Air, the US House of Representatives, World Methodist Conference. He's also the author of 2 award-winning books and has another book that's set to come out. Next is Brandon Castillo. Brandon was born in New York, grew up in Sherman, Texas, currently lives in Old East Dallas. He's the founder of the Deep Ellum Outdoor Market and has produced numerous cultural food events in Dallas. Brandon is somewhat of a historian about the Southeast Asian refugee community in Dallas. That community, I believe, settled in the Old East Dallas area in the late 70s and 80s. And Brandon, becoming a resident, took an interest, and basically now he's an expert. He currently works with the Jewish Family Service, which provides housing assistance for households financially affected by COVID. And lastly, Justina Walford. She's the founder and director of this festival, the Women Texas Film Festival. She's a critically acclaimed writer, producer, and performer of stage, screen, and print. She used to live in LA, where she was artistic director of Split Stage in Hollywood. From there, she moved to New York City, where she began creating with her husband, John Wildman. In 2015, Justina and her husband moved here to East Oak Cliff in Dallas, where she became an activist focusing on environmental racism. She's currently on the boards of Southern Sector Rising and Downwinders at Risk, is that it? Where she fights the ongoing battle against Shingle Mountain, which is basically, I think it's 100,000 tons of illegally dumped asphalt shingles that are spilling into resident yards in that area. Yes. So that's what she's doing now. Okay, I guess we can move on. All right, so I watched the documentary 3 times, loved it. I love the personal story of the father, Charles Chiu. It was also very eye-opening for me because as I spoke with Justina earlier this week, Asian Americans were kind of absent in American history books when I was growing up. So I learned a few things here and there, but I never knew what our place was in the segregated period of this country. So amazing film. Guess my first question, in the beginning of the film, Edwin says, the plan was to just drive around Mississippi, find a cemetery, and find the tombstone with a Chinese man's name. So what was your vision when you first started filming? What did you think this could be?
It was a family vacation, honestly. I mean, we were not planning to make a documentary. We thought we literally were taking a family vacation. We were going to go hopefully find the grave site and pay our respects and then go back to California.
In fact, my since we're married, my comment to Larissa was, just stay out of our way. We're going to try to figure out this whole family roots thing, take care of our daughter. She was
only
around.
Like 15 months at the time.
She's going to be driving us crazy.
I was probably the babysitter.
So just watch her, keep her out of our hair. Let us figure this out so that one day we could let her know where her family roots is.
And that was it. And then as the event started to unfold, as if you've seen the film, some remarkable things started to happen with personal items and even just the history. Then I was going, what is going on here? Why don't we, one, know this history, as you were mentioning, of the Chinese in the South? Because it wasn't in my history books either, you know. And I took AP US history, just like Edwin, Baldwin's brother, mentioned in the film. Nowhere did I read about it. And I'm going, what is going on here? How come there's a Chinese museum in the middle of Mississippi? There had to have been a significant population here. And as we learned the stories, we realized, oh my gosh, this is such an critical point in American history that we don't know about. And so that's when we started, or at least I got the bright idea, you know what, maybe our little family vacation needs to become a little bit more, because it was just such an incredible story with the personal revelations and the historical revelations that I really felt like more people needed to know about it. And so we did a short film first called Finding Cleveland 4 or 5 years ago. And that was kind of our experiment. Well, if people don't care about it, then we just won't make another film. And we decided that more people wanted to find out more. We wanted to find out more about Baldwin's family, and what you see is far east, deep south of everything that we discovered so far.
So how much of a time span does the documentary cover?
5 years.
About 5 years.
5 years, yeah. So
5
you see
years.
my daughter. Yeah, my daughter was only like 15 months.
I think maybe about 4, because I think she's 4 in the last scene. So
yeah,
roughly 4. I mean, we were in post-production for a year. So the actual filming was 4 years. And then we spent another year in post, yeah.
Have you ever filmed your family before as a director? Aside from vacation films.
Well, you know, I actually have a background in music. So initially for the 14-minute short, Finding Cleveland, I was brought on to be the music composer. And then I saw a rough cut that my editor and Baldwin did. And I said, oh no, this is not going to work. So then I decided to take the reins, and my directing career was born. I had directed some theater in the past, and had produced some television. So it wasn't completely foreign to me, but certainly working on a documentary, especially a feature-length one, this was actually my first film. But I hope I did it justice, and I really felt like it was a story I wanted to tell.
Mm-hmm. And Baldwin, what was it like to have your personal story told on film?
Definitely not something I expected would have ever happened. In fact, even just talking to my dad about it, it was like, this was supposed to be something personal. It was supposed to be just to educate my daughter. Hopefully we find something out about our past that makes her proud to be an American. I was always proud to be American, but we didn't realize, we really didn't realize how deep those American roots really were. So it really just started off as a story for my daughter, so that she would not have to go through the same types of, go through some of the comments, hear the comments that we heard when we were growing up, and she would feel that this really was her country, and she should know, and she should not have to fight for people to understand that it's hers.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is I think it took an outsider, like myself, because I was, married to the family, to kind of see the bigger picture. Whereas his dad, if you see the movie, him, he is a very private person. So, to get some of the moments that I captured was very surprising for a lot of them. But the fact that, in the sense this was his personal journey, and I think, he had never dealt with these feelings. He had never learned a lot of this history. And so they were very uncomfortable with it at first, but somehow he trusted me to tell the story. So I think Dad, he might even be watching right now.
I think he is watching in the next room. Definitely trusted her more than me. My dad didn't even, most of the stuff I never knew about until Larissa interviewed him.
Apparently he likes me better.
Yeah, I don't really blame him.
So at what point did you realize that you had something good here?
I think for those who haven't seen the movie, without giving it away too much.
Go ahead and spoil it.
Well, we found a very important personal artifact in the museum, right? We found a Bible in the museum. Oops, spoiler alert.
Yes.
That was the beginning of where I started to realize, like, oh my gosh, there's something very special. And then as the day unfolded and we met other people, and for the first trip, like, this was starting to get crazy that all these things were happening. And I'm like, I couldn't have scripted it better. So I'll give an assist to, like, God scripted it better than we could have ever scripted it. So
yeah, I think if it wasn't a Bible, I mean, I know that's a spoiler, but like if it was just like
a bookmark
or something like that, it wouldn't have been it would have been memorable for us, but it would not have been as enlightening. It wouldn't have been as impactful, and just because of the significance of that book.
Mm-hmm.
Especially in Chinese, right? The book is in Chinese in the middle of Mississippi.
Oh, was it in Chinese? I couldn't tell.
Yeah, actually, we didn't open it up.
It was actually written in Chinese.
Yeah, it was a
Chinese language.
It was a Chinese language Bible in Mississippi from the 30s and 40s.
I'm assuming your father has read the documentary.
He's viewed it several times.
Okay.
He is, he was actually the one I was most scared to show the film to, because if he didn't like it, then I would have felt terrible, putting it out into the world. And I know it was so personal, and the fact that he enjoyed the film. And if anything, he felt he had a better understanding of how his family was negatively impacted by the Chinese Exclusion Act. I think he understands now, like, why his family was separated, because I think that was the most difficult thing, is he grew up without a father. He didn't understand why. He thought he had just been left behind in China. And so knowing that there were laws bigger than him that were not in his control, I don't know if it made him feel better, but at least it gave him a better understanding. And if anything, he feels very compelled to, like, everybody needs to know about the Chinese Exclusion Act. Everybody needs to know about this history. Everybody needs to know what went on in the South and the discrimination that was there. And it was really hard for, not just the Black community, but also the Chinese community, and how they had to work together and they had to, help each other to get through this difficult time. So he is very much on board now with the film.
So one of the things that I found interesting was there are a few scenes when you guys are talking with, elderly white residents of Mississippi, and they seem to have very idyllic and very clean and just rosy memories of, Casey Liu, your father's father. And given that was a segregated South, I couldn't help but wonder, like, are they consciously or subconsciously leaving something out, or was it really that rosy? I mean, did you get a sense that their memories might have been a little tainted?
Well, I think from a personal level, I think there's that's always the way history is, right? Like, there's the personal level, and then there's obviously the societal level. And I'm sure societal wise, it is not rosy by any means. But the fact is, what was surprising is they viewed, Casey Liu positively. Now, I don't know what was being said behind closed doors. We'll never know. And certainly in the course of some of our, discussions with people, there were definitely microaggression comments. Again, when it came to, labeling of people, and it was even used by some of the older Chinese people, where they use the word like Chinaman, and it wasn't, again, not to give it a pass, but it wasn't necessarily used derogatorily, but sadly, that's how people talked back in the South. So that, in a sense, was there. But I think a lot of them, which was surprising, and most of the people that we interviewed realized this was like what 40s, 50s, 60s, right? Like, or maybe 40, 50s, or some of them that were, sorry, your grandfather, he died in 46. So it's before 1946. So by then the 30s and 40s, things were a little bit better for as far as some of the white people viewing some of the Chinese, because they had been there a little longer. Whereas you had asked people probably early 1900s or late 1800s, the Chinese, and none of those white people are still alive. Like they probably had a very, very negative view.
But also if you're looking at the timeline, this was probably in the 30s and the 40s. The people in the film are older, but when they knew my grandfather Casey Liu, they were kids. So I think that goes back to our understanding and our feeling that racism is really taught. And when you're a little kid and all you see are people being kind to you, you living in the community and they're your neighbors. And if racism hasn't, those thoughts and those stereotypes haven't set in your mind yet when you're 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, then your heart is a little more pure. And so your recollection and your memory is cleaner. Then maybe when you get older and you start talking to other older people from other parts of the country in that time era, especially. And also mind you that remember that they were living in the Black community. They were living in Pace, Mississippi, which was predominantly Black. And John Bassie, who you saw in the film, is Italian. His family was also not considered white. They were Italians. And the neighbor next to them,
and same thing with the Jewish community. They were not treated as pure white as well.
So they all lived in that Black community together. So when you see John Bassie, an older white guy, talking about hanging out in Casey Liu's store, this was the Italian guy who was not able to live in the white community, who had a store next to the Chinese grocery store.
That was the one thing I didn't have time to go into all the nuances of how race is constructed historically, but we had several of our Black mayors in our film, talk about that, how the race was kind of fluid throughout history in terms of how people viewed it, and like a lot of groups were considered non-white, not just Asians, but Italians were not considered completely white. They were discriminated against too during a period of time. So it was very interesting. And that's like a whole nother movie to dive into just how race is constructed and perceived over history.
Yeah, that's definitely very interesting. So
to jump in, I really would love to talk to the other people on the panel about that exact thing, that like Dallas also, to this day, one could argue a segregated community, a segregated city. Like our history with the Asian population and the Black community, like that's had a younger evolution, I guess. Brandon, am I right? Or actually, would I be shocked to find out that Dallas has the same thing as Oxford or as Mississippi, where you're here forever?
From what I understand, much of the East Asian immigration into Dallas came after 1965. I forgot the name of that particular legislation, but it was basically...
It's the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, or the Hart-Celler Act, yeah.
So you don't see a large influx of Asian immigrants until after. So, what mixing is happening I could see, it isn't necessarily happening in Dallas. It's happening in Plano, Richardson, Garland, Grand Prairie, Arlington. Especially if you came to the United States with money, you didn't go, you went to DFW, right? But you didn't go to Dallas. You went where everyone else was going, era, which is leaving Dallas, especially if you're middle class, you're leaving Dallas and you're going to the suburbs. So I see a lot of Asian immigrants right now. Now, how they integrated with each other in the various suburbs, it changes. It kind of depends on the community and who and what era. But that's, I think, what's distinct about Dallas. It was not a destination for the immigration and the act in 1965.
I think, to me, that raises another question. Having grown up in the East Coast, New York, people always assumed that it was a liberal bastion. Oh, everything was so much better up there. But, my experience, kind of everywhere. Segregation, it's everywhere. Like New York City has the most segregated school system in the country. It's everywhere. So that's tricky for me. kind of feel like it's everywhere. It's a problem all across the nation. Yeah.
If I could speak to that reality, you know, race itself is a social construct created for the exploitation of human labor that really builds around the time of colonialism and chattel slavery. And, you know, there is no such thing as race biologically. That construct was supported through the pseudoscience of the Enlightenment period and also through the white supremacist biblical theologies that were emergent at that time. And it has been codified, it has been reinforced with violence. It's very important for me to acknowledge that the Mississippi Delta is a place of brutalities. The spaces in which the film unfolds are areas where Black people were brutalized for generations. As a matter of fact, only about 40 miles from Pace, you are in the Glendora era. And in Glendora, off of the Black Bayou Bridge, a young boy by the name of Emmett Till was dropped in the water after having been brutalized and driven over 70 miles in the Delta, shot, maimed, brutalized, and his body found floating downstream a few days later. And if you talk with the persons of that area, and I direct a civil rights pilgrimage. I began one at Southern Methodist University 15 years. It goes throughout the Deep South, the cities and sites significant to the civil rights movement, to talk with persons who were engaged in the movement at that time. The natives of that area speak very clearly to the fact that there was nothing exceptional about Emmett Till, that they were always pulling bodies out of the water. And so to speak to that level of terrorism, domestic terrorism, we're really talking about layers of harm that have been done to a multiplicity of communities and that are continued to be enacted today. You know, the Mississippi Delta today is one of the poorest areas in America, which is a part of that ongoing legacy of race and economic disenfranchisement that has been in that community for years. And not to give Dallas a pass. I mean, Dallas itself is the capital of functional white supremacy in America. We often fail to tell our story, but that at one point in Dallas history, 1 out of every 3 eligible men in the city was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. And that in 2018, the Urban Institute did a study of 274 American cities with a population over 100,000 and found that Dallas ranked dead last in the combinations of racial equity and racial segregation, 274 out of 274 American cities. And that makes sense in a city that has allowed a shingle mountain to live and thrive as long as it does. And so I appreciate the film, not just in the fact that it's an invitation to delve deeper into the layers of our history and the multiplicity of communities that have been harmed by white supremacy. But to me, it also connects the dots to today, because as we're talking about the Exclusion Act, we also have a white supremacist president who talks about the coronavirus in negative and derogatory terms. And so this is living reality. We're living with those same levels of harm today that are bringing about just as much of a body count as they ever have before. So this is a timely film. I don't know that this was intended as such, but in journeying with your family back in time, frankly, it took us all on that journey to bring us forward to present day. And I'll finally say this, since you've already mentioned it, the scene with the Bible is of great importance, because for many communities, but I know particularly for the Black community, the Bible has not just been or served for those who believe or those who are Christian, not just served as their scriptures, but it's also been the place where you wrote down marriages and wrote down births. So it was a genealogy of sorts, not just biblically, but also for your family, which is so critically important for people who are enslaved and can only go so far back in your history to know the epistemology of where you came from and what has brought you forth. And so there's an existential importance for the Bible, for our communities, in capturing our family story. And it was just so powerful to see that it was the missing clue to connect you with your family story hidden in that Bible as well. That was really a fascinating and moving portion of the film.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Wow, that was great.
Yeah, no, I mean, and one of the things that we really hoped, I mean, we didn't know the things would happen the way they would in 2020, right? When we made the film and when we started out on this journey. And even as we talk, no matter who's president after November, unfortunately, there's still going to be these issues because it's not just with one person, right? Because there's obviously a lot of people that have these misperceptions of the coronavirus coming from people that are of Asian descent, no matter, even though we had nothing to do with it, those of us who are American, right? And some people just, don't understand those nuances, which is what we hope we shed light on that. And from our community too, with the Black Lives Matter movement and what happened with George Floyd and countless other people that obviously have been victim to police brutality and shootings, I think a lot of people in the Asian community didn't feel a connection maybe to the story of slavery or to segregation or to that because they didn't learn it in their history books. And so what we've heard time and time again from teachers and from other Asian Americans is like, this story in our film sheds light that the fact there is this shared history between our communities that we don't know about. And so that I think there's a deeper level of empathy and understanding for what's going on between both communities, hopefully through the film.
I think it's really interesting that Yuri Kochiyama, who was with Malcolm X during that time and worked with him, she talked about how she met him. And it was interesting that she said, I didn't want to approach him because I was afraid he wouldn't want to talk to a little Japanese woman like me. And it's interesting that in the Asian community, we have sort of a fear to be an ally. I mean, there's lots of layers, right? There's the model minority myth. There is a strange separation with the immigration stance and things like that we have because we have a lot of history right now in America in immigration. But to one, never have learned about her and barely learned about Malcolm X, to be quite honest, in our public schools. And then to learn about her and realize that we in the Asian American community had a huge movement of yellow peril supports Black power that we were never told and had to look for ourselves. And what I love about this film is that it invites us to come back to those roots and be allies in this movement together again, which we did not know. I certainly did not learn. And now that I am learning so much more about our history and how much is erased, it's very empowering to have films like this where I can go, oh, we actually were allies. We do have history. We can utilize that now.
Yeah, one of the things I like to say is that, like, historically, especially, if we can't see ourselves together in the past, then how can we see ourselves together in the future? And so I believe, the stories that we're showing in this film hopefully ignites other people to tell stories that are similar, to show how much more we have in common than we have that are different. There's clearly differences that we have, but the differences are what makes things beautiful. But it's the commonalities that unite us. And so, and we hear so many times, even within our community, that like, well, we got our own issues. We got to deal with our own things that the other people don't understand. So why should we go out and fight for what's just for them if we're still dealing with what's just for us? And if we stop seeing it as a me first, you next, and we start seeing it as we always have been and we've gone through this together, so let's continue doing this together so that we're just in the future, then I think that story plays out easier when we have that understanding of where we've been historically.
I think it's also important to acknowledge, one, that our lack of access to this history was intentional. It wasn't by happenstance. And so one of the important, one of the more powerful aspects of this film is that we are able to tell our own narratives. And when we tell our own narrative, when we center ourselves in the story, it moves to a different outcome, right? That understanding that as long as the lion tells his own story, the lion is the hero. And all that have run from are unable to share that story. So that's one aspect I think that's very important. Another thing to acknowledge is this idea of Sankofa, which comes to us from Africa. And it's a symbol that you can go back and fetch it. The idea that you really can't know what is coming ahead of you until you investigate what is behind you. And that our history helps to point us to a brighter future. And so here's the reality. Our communities have found strength together for years. My favorite book is Dr. King's Stride Toward Freedom, his very first book published in 1958. And in that book, he states very clearly that some of the very first portions of financial support that the movement received in Montgomery came from Asian countries, right?
Wow.
Now, a lot of people don't know that at
No.
the very beginnings of the civil rights movement, there were persons in a multiplicity of Asian countries who were sending their dollars to support the Black liberation struggle. One of my great joys several years ago, or a couple of years ago, I had the privilege of speaking, giving a keynote for the rededication of the Malcolm X Center in New York, the very place of his martyrdom. And when you really even talk about Black nationalism or the work of Malcolm X and even Dr. King, particularly towards their latter years, they saw global liberation. They saw intersectionality, this idea that the struggle, if you will, that was happening in Vietnam, right? Dr. King took a great risk by connecting that struggle with the struggle of Black people in America. Same is true for Malcolm X, linking our struggles across national boundaries and seeing our liberation as a collective reality, right? And so we're made stronger. I'll say this finally, we're made stronger when we reclaim those histories and allow them to inform our present, because we're all experiencing levels of hostility and brutality. I mean, since we've been in the pandemic, hate crimes against Asian Americans have increased. We must acknowledge that. But if we acknowledge our history of solidarity, we can gain strength together to support each other in the fight.
Yeah.
Amen
to that.
Yep.
No, that's what I think is important that the film does, right? Is that you went through pains, literally traveling across the country to discover your roots and your history, where our parents, our immigrant parents, aren't necessarily very forthcoming about that type of history. That's what I find consistent in a lot of storytelling of Asian Americans in our generation. And so exactly what you said, Reverend Waters, that it's incumbent upon us to dig, to get past that Asian wall, right? And to break through it and figure out what our story is, even though our parents are reluctant to give us that information.
Yeah, because if we don't tell our stories, either no one will, or they will tell in a way that is not accurate, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think the other thing is that Asian Americans were a really diverse group made up of multiple ethnicities, right? And we all have different stories. For instance, I don't think Korean Americans have a long history in the country that Chinese Americans do in the Mississippi Delta, for instance. So, I mean, I guess my question is, what type of challenge does that present in building allyship when you're dealing with a group that is so diverse and has such different experiences? Like, how do you bring them together to work as allies with the Black American community?
Wow, that's a good one. I think first thing it's what you just said, is we need to acknowledge that there is a difference within our own Asian American community, that there is so much diversity in there. I think one of the problems is that people try to put us all in that same category as Asian American, and they don't see anything different from someone that's Filipino or Korean or Japanese American as Chinese American. But laying down the understanding that, maybe the Chinese Americans were the first ones in America that has a lot of history in America. Even though we understand that Filipinos came here, in 1500s, right? They landed in California in the 1500s. No one ever talks about that. But as far as significant other things where a large mass Asian Americans came in, it was the early Chinese. So I think in that sense, we need to understand that if our country's social aspect lumps us all together, then it makes good for everyone to understand how certain immigrant groups that are also Asian American have also paved the way so that the new immigrants that come in here may not understand it, such as you're mentioning the Koreans, you know, like most Koreans didn't come in here until after 1965. And you understand, then if the Korean immigrants understood, well, why is it that we didn't come here until 1965? Chinese people have been here since the 1800s. Right? Then they can start understanding, well, what was in place. We start talking about the Chinese Exclusion Act, but it really
wasn't just the Chinese
Exclusion Act, right? People think it's a Chinese exclusion. It was an Asian Exclusion Act. It was a North African Exclusion Act. It was an Eastern European Exclusion Act. It encompassed so many different ethnic groups. Yet, so when we understand that we all were in this together at one point, then when the newer immigrants come in, we need to figure out ways to educate them. So they're not coming in as oh, this is now the land of opportunity. Let's just go in this all in for ourselves and let's just go out there and make our money, right?
Basically the model minority myth, right? If you work hard, you can do anything.
Right. Right. Well, and the thing is that's crazy is, you know, and we saw this in during the pandemic, right? Like when people started attacking, you know, Asians for the coronavirus and falsely blaming them, you started seeing store owners that were, you know, Korean or Vietnamese going like, we're not Chinese. Yeah. And like, no, we're not like them. But the thing is, you know, going back to like, how do you find allyship? It's like, even though you know you're not, unfortunately, everybody perceives you to be. So there's strength in numbers in the sense that like the Latinx, Hispanic communities, they have a shared language, even though they're very diverse too. Somebody from Central America is very different than somebody from Mexico and from South America. But yet they have found some ways to create, you know, a stronger coalition of people. And so there's a very important, you know, part in trying to gather that Asian American support and letting them know it's like, even though we are different and we have different histories, we do have some shared history, and the fact that we need to work together if we're going to make progress, because you guys can't do it alone in your individual subgroups. Because again, the way that non-Asians are perceive us, they see us as all the same, unfortunately, you know.
We're all Chinese.
We're all Chinese. It's interesting. I went to in LA, there's an Asian American museum, and it has a lot on the internment camps. And it had this amazing like tear sheet from a magazine, and it was how to tell the difference between a Chinese and a Japanese. Because our hate was for the Japanese at that time. You wanted to make sure you didn't say anything bad to a Chinese person. You wanted to say all the bad stuff to a Japanese person, which has led us to this realm of I'm not them. I'm not whoever's being attacked right now. I'm not them. And we have to get on the defensive in our communities to be like, for our safety. And then it causes that chasm yet again of we can't fight together because we're constantly being told that we're separate. And I think it is back to what Reverend Waters was saying of that propaganda of making us all little tiny communities fighting one very large monster. When the moment we can actually get rid of that poster and not be an embodiment of that today, we can heal so much faster. That would be really, that's the aim.
Yeah, you know what's ironic is that so the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act started in 1943, and ironically, that was when they said, okay, we're gonna start lifting these sanctions off of Chinese people, but at that same time, they were like, oh, let's start putting the Japanese into internment camps, right? So let's kind of free one group, but
because we needed China as an ally, and let's put somebody else.
Yeah, let's take the other.
Let's incarcerate a bunch of other people.
And it's ironic. It was around that same time, 1943, right, around the World War II time. So,
well, you guys brought up in the film that senator, and you can tell it, but that senator basically brought your grandfather over, but then is also a hardcore segregation.
Yeah, it was actually Baldwin's dad. Yeah.
How does he square that? How do you, I don't know. I that was really confusing to me, and I didn't understand.
That's how we wanted you to feel, because that's how we felt, because people were like, oh, you guys didn't really resolve that. I'm like, it was intentional because we thought it was interesting to put that, again, history and politics is not clean. It's not always black and white, right? And so we had probably the leading segregationalist in history, Senator James Eastland, who was the one who signed the special bill that allowed his father to come into this country. And yet historically, again, he's the big bad in anti-civil rights. He opposed immigration. Apparently, he also opposed immigration, and he sat on the immigration, committee, and yet he, was a restrictionalist, and so he signed the special bill. How do you reconcile that? We this is how we say it. It's like sometimes it's like someone say you could have like the greatest villain in history. If they saved you from a burning building, would you just say, leave me here in the burning building? Some people might say yes. Some people would still be grateful for them saving, their baby or saving them from that burning building. And that's kind of, I think, where this was. Baldwin's dad had no idea. We actually didn't even know he was this big segregationalist until after our first, trip, because we met his son. He's not alive anymore, Senator Eastland. And so we didn't learn about him growing up, in our history books in California. And I don't know if you learn about it in Texas, but certainly people in Mississippi know about him, but a lot of people don't know, and sadly. Yeah. And so we just felt conflicted. We're like, his dad is so grateful of what he did. And in the Asian culture, you're just grateful. If somebody does something, there's this feeling of obligation. You're just grateful forever. And then at the same time, we're like, oh my gosh, he was like the biggest villain in history when it came to civil rights.
Yeah, the good thing, if you want to call it a good thing, it was like, when we talked to his son, Woods Eastland, I mean, he was very honest with us, and we were honest with him. We're like, hey, how do we tackle this? I mean, we definitely want to talk to you about it. We want you to be honest about it. And I loved how he was able to talk about it in the film, and how there was complexities there, but yet the political aspect was they could do something that's strange because they're trying to pull favors from other political people. So then you start understanding, well, maybe his beliefs was more political than personal. And maybe, yes, some of it was personal, but sometimes his personal beliefs was driven by political, forces, right? But then at the same time, what we don't talk about in the film was that Senator Eastland's right-hand man was Courtney Pace, which is Pace, Mississippi, which my grandfather and great-grandfather had their store. So then, what we didn't have time to really explain, because it gets into a whole nother thing about relationships, building relationships with people, and how relationships can sometimes change the way somebody acts. Like you might be on a total
like
stance,
I hate Asians, and
right?
then you become friends.
Then you become friends with an Asian person. And they're like,
and they change your mind.
Well, maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I don't hate them all.
Baby steps. But that's how you kind of, I guess, overcome the long-term implications of, racist attitude is by winning them, with relationships. And sadly, as he mentioned in the example of the politics, you see that in play today, where people are using, whether they believe it or not, they will say it just to motivate people to vote a certain way or to stoke fear in people. So, historical records and personal records are very tricky things, and we wanted people to be kind of uncomfortable with it and question it too.
I think that's important. And when you look at race, I mean, the whole notion of race is built upon this sense of categories, that as you darken pigmentation, you lessen humanity. That's the way it's set up. So the more darkly pigmented you are and your people are, the farther away you are from normative whiteness. And those categories then provide for infighting amongst the oppressed, right? Because no one wants, the worst thing you can be identified with in some regards in the American enterprise is with Blackness, because Blackness is at the far end spectrum of all that should be degraded and left aside. And as your pigmentation lightens along the spectrum, the closer you come to be included amongst humanity. And interestingly enough, that's a biblical aspect. It's one of those extra narratives around this idea of the curse of Ham and the sons of Noah. And nowhere do you see in that narrative that when Ham is cursed by Noah, that the demarcation of his curse is the darkness of his pigmentation. But that's how that was interpreted from the Enlightenment period going forward. That when you see my skin color, my Blackness, particularly for persons in Mississippi and throughout the Deep South, was a sign of being accursed and of being subhuman and ready to be oppressed and utilized for both profits and pleasure. So again, when you fall into that narrative, then you have this infighting amongst quote unquote minorities who can't see that their liberation is collective and that none of us are free until we are all free. And so again, I think this is a stunning portrait of America, of oppressed communities growing up, living side by side. This may not have necessarily been the intent of the film, but I think it comes out through the film that our liberation comes through opposing white supremacy. And one of the great ways that we oppose white supremacy is learning our story. When you know who you are, and when you hold on to that truth and you share it to your children and to generations unborn, you provide them with the strength and power that enables them to navigate the very real harm that is still present in America. So to me, this is a liberation story. It's not simply a family story. It's not simply a family narrative, but it's in the old words of the song, is a story of how we made it over, right? And how we are continuing to make it over today.
Yeah.
Nice.
So
That's
as
a
a
great
practical matter, how do we spread the storytelling? How do we get our stories out? Through what the documentary is a great example. What are other ways that we can tell our story?
Yeah, I mean, not everyone's going to make a film about their stories, but we live in a time where technology is great. You know, at any moment you can just whip out your phone and hit record. And so what we've been trying to do ever since we did Finding Cleveland, which was the short film, is we made this Finding Cleveland experience where we would, as musicians, we would do some hip hop, we'd rap, we'd sing, we'd bring in, and we try to bring in the younger generations to this to come together to watch. To not only enjoy the music, but then to sit down and watch a film. And then we bring the older community in. And it was like a cross-generational experience. You had young and older and everyone in between. And then we would talk about how, okay, now you have a grandfather sitting next to their grandchild. Let's start talking to each other. How many grandparents are in there right now and have never told your grandchild where your family came from? Where was your father from? And so we really try to encourage the young people to start taking out their phones, just hit the record. Let's just talk to your grandparents. You know, hopefully they're still around. And
also for the younger people, I mean, one of the things that you see in our film is his, Baldwin's dad, I don't think thought his kids were interested when they were kids. And they probably weren't when they were like 5 or 6 years old. But as they got older, and I think we have this perception, that you see your kids as always kids, even if they're in their 20s or 30s, and then you just still not tell them the stories. But I think it's important for the younger, like I think I know more about Baldwin's grandfather and great grandparents than mine. And I knew all my grandparents, and I grew up with 3 of them. So, and I regret they're all passed away now. Like I didn't take the time to ask them about their histories. They came over from China. They lived through the Great Depression. They lived through civil wars. They've lived through, World War II. They lived through communism. Or escaped communism, I should say. There were so many rich stories that I never got to ask them about. And so I think it's up to both all the generations to collectively come together to tell the stories, whether it's written, whether it's, putting it at, again, whipping out your voice memo on your phone, writing it down in a journal, videotaping it, and even if no one ever sees it in the world. And there's a lot of museums that are collecting oral histories and that are asking for submissions that are now trying to keep all those records of different families and to tell it, because if you don't tell it, no one will.
And even educators, like getting educators on board. We've had a lot of people say, well, we can't change our history books right away. But the fortunate thing is that teachers have enough freedom to say, well, let's add this to the core curriculum. So getting teachers on board to tell more diverse stories, not for the sake of diversity, but for the sake of accuracy. And to get history teachers to be doing that, to get English teachers to do that, there's so many ways we can incorporate it into just regular course curriculum. And hopefully eventually, it can be changed in national course curriculum, but going on the local levels first and having educators take that stance to say, we want these stories because it broadens our understanding of what America and American really is.
And I think it's important. Please, Brandon, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. My wife is a teacher, and she definitely does that strategy exactly. She's Vietnamese stories and other, Central American stories as part of her reading curriculum. So yes, I think that's very good advice. And I think another angle that we can go about exploring our history and also sharing that history with other people is with food. I'm obsessed with food. And
I was going to ask you about that.
yes. The first time my 2-year-old daughter ate pork adobo and rice, like, oh, it warmed my heart so much. She just ate it up, It's like, that is just like the dish of Filipinos, right? Pork adobo and rice. Everyone eats that. And the fact that she is eating it, I fully intend to teach her how to make it. And then, this is how my dad makes it, as opposed to other people's pork adobo, So, and on top of that, you can share that with people. It doesn't matter if you're Filipino or not. I mean, you're going to like pork adobo, provided you eat meat. Right.
Right.
And
There is a scene. Oh.
I want to add also, like, along with the telling, it's the listening as well. I think, just like we need to learn about our own history. I didn't know about the Tulsa Massacre until 2 years ago.
Same
so
here.
that's the whole thing, right? So, like, hearing other cultures and other ethnicities and other people and other Americans and what their history is, and finding out that, and then we can actually tell our kids and our grandkids their stories as much as our own stories. That would be fantastic.
I think that's important.
TikTok. I'm just gonna say it. I listen to TikTok. The kids know stuff.
So most of my books have been adult nonfiction books dealing with race. Excuse me. Well, recently I wrote my first children's book. Comes out next month, called For Beautiful Black Boys Who Believe in a Better World. And it has a guide in it put together by the Muhammad Ali Center with the blessing of Muhammad Ali's widow, Lani Ali. And this is an introduction for young people into understanding racial violence, understanding police brutality, understanding gun violence, and giving them hope towards moving towards a better day. So I absolutely believe that our greatest power is in the power of telling our stories. I've been grateful for the support this has received so far. It's been in top 5 on Amazon since May, but it's just very important that we tell these stories and that we share our narratives with our children, right? Because for many of us, we may have been introduced to these stories later in life, but imagine the grounding and power to hear these stories and understand your narrative as a child. And finally, Baldwin, I think we're hip hop fans together. I want to know what you think about Wu-Tang. I can only imagine just the gift of hip hop. There's a reason why hip hop is a global force. It's the reason why it's the most listened to genre in the world, is because it is a sound of liberation. There's a reason why Vladimir Putin was trying to ban it in Russia, right? Because it's the sound of the young people towards liberation. Everywhere you see people striving to live out their full humanity, it's usually to a hip hop beat. It's the sound of Black Lives Matter. We gonna be all right, right? And so using that tool, that genre, I think it's a powerful tool as well, because in and of itself, it tells a narrative. If you want to know what was going on in Black America in the 1980s and 1990s, particularly as it relates to police brutality, the greatest resources are going to be NWA and Public Enemy that are telling those stories, right? And there's so much that you can pack into song with a beat and use it as a teaching tool. That's part of my doctoral background is how hip hop is utilized as a teaching tool. So you're on the right track. But the beautiful thing, though, the reason I lifted up Wu-Tang is you have these young men from Staten Island who are fascinated with Asian culture, and they build their entire movement around it. And you have this way of these two communities informing each other now on a global scale. And to me, that's beautiful. When we can find ways of uniting our cultures and uniting our stories, there's no limitation to the power that can be revealed to the world.
I don't know if I could say that any better than that.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think Rizza's like actually more Asian than I am because he loves Asian culture.
So the first reason, one of the first things that made me fall in love with Larissa was she told me that Public Enemy was her favorite group.
I was a big Public Enemy fan. I mean, still am a big Public Enemy fan. So,
but I mean, the thing about like hip hop is like I love it that it can go. I mean, a lot of people want to say like hip hop's a black thing, but I think hip hop has evolved so much that it's no longer just a black thing. It's a voice to the voiceless. And even if you just think about like, she's a songwriter, but I'm a songwriter, but I write raps. It's like we could put so many more words in a song when we're writing a rap song, as opposed to when she's writing a ballad, right? And it's like you could put so much. I mean, that's why Hamilton was so big, right? You could put so much history in one musical than if you sang the whole thing. You get like hardly any.
And we did our own little take on a Hamilton video that was infusing some Asian American history into one of the Hamilton songs.
We basically broke down the entire Asian American history in 3 minutes. But the thing with, but like with hip hop, I mean, it's going into China now, right? And the hip hop's like a way where you can voice out the things that you can't really voice out, that society has not voiced for you. So it's given you a voice to say like, these are some of the injustices, and these are the ways you can creatively enjoy other things other than just social aspects and talk about social issues. And so like even in China, like with hip hop getting really big there, I mean, there are Chinese rappers out there that are now being banned by the communist government because they're being too vocal about things that are truth. And so my dad's listening right now. He's not a big hip hop fan.
No, he's not. But I mean, just in the same way that Brandon mentioned food, I think music is a uniting factor, in communities and helping us bond, because now you appreciate another person's history, another person's culture. And so there's, entertainment and film, and there's so many other things, art and culture, food can unite us.
Baldwin, was that your hip hop song in the beginning of the movie?
Yeah. In Chinatown when I was rapping in Chinese and English. Yeah.
Very cool. Very cool.
So I really want to ask another question, but I think we need to wrap this up, unfortunately. Do we have time? We don't have time. We have like 3 minutes. So, I love this discussion. I love the documentary. Larissa, can you just tell us, like, if there's one thing that you wish viewers could take away from the documentary, what would that be?
Just one.
Just one.
Only one.
You can squeeze in a second one if you can.
I really hope people, again, will look at who they think of as an American, and the need for us to tell our kids, just as, Reverend Waters was saying, like, we are all Americans that are here in this country. And so we have a shared history, no matter who you are. Let's find out where those connecting points are, and let's try to move forward. I know I don't know if that was one, but that was my answer.
To add to that, I just want to say, like, I hope the film lets people realize that we all, have more in common than that we have that are different. And the differences that we have should only enhance our want and our desire to understand what we do have in common.
Thank you. I guess that wraps up the discussion. Thank you, everyone.
Stay in touch with all of you guys.
Yeah, and if people want to know more and stay in touch with when our film is going to be showing next or having similar discussions, they can go to our website, fareastdeepsouth.com. They can subscribe to our email list. They can follow us on social media there. But, we love having discussions like this. So thank you, everybody. And thank you, Justina, and for Women Texas Film Festival for hosting our film.
Thank you.
Reverend Waters, let's stay connected. I want to stay in touch with you.
And Brandon, we'll have some adobo when we get out to Texas. And lumpia too, man. I love lumpia.
Indeed, absolutely.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
God bless you.